Many forms of torture were utilised during the Middle Ages, but the rack was perhaps the most popular and most feared. Although it was common for joints to be dislocated during the process, the torture could tear a victim's limbs apart and rip them from their sockets. Heads up, this video is pretty gnarly. Welcome to Medieval Madness. An unlawful act. Torture has never been officially sanctioned in the law courts of England. It was always used as an instrument of the state and allowed under the warrant of a monarch. Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators who were involved in the failed gunpowder plot were tortured under a warrant signed by King James I, and the torture used under the royal warrant was the rack. The Tudors were quite fond of a bit of torture too, as apparently the rack seldom stood idle in the Tower for all the latter part of Elizabeth's reign. Those who were in charge of executing the warrant had to report the results of their interrogation sessions directly back to the monarch. Evidence was taken before, during, and after torture. In Old English law, a prisoner had to make a plea of either guilty or not guilty before a trial could proceed. The only exception to this rule was in the case of treason, when a refusal to plead was treated as an admission of guilt. It was important to try and make a prisoner who stood mute of malice declare one way or the other, because the property of a person who was sentenced to death and subsequently executed was forfeited to the crown. Victims knew that if they wished their heirs to inherit their estate and they died whilst undergoing torture rather than at execution, without making a plea, the forfeiture was void, and their relatives would receive their inheritance. Later rules were laid out by the courts that included a torture clause, but that didn't work, and still a lot of prisoners refused to plead because many did not want their children to suffer the stigma of a hanged father. An order was made for torture as soon as refusal was made for a plea. In the early Middle Ages, the prisoner was then taken back to prison, stripped naked, and made to lie on the stone floor of the cell. All comforts such as rushes, blankets, or a mattress were taken away. Each of his limbs was stretched out to the four corners of the cell and shackled to metal rings. He was left there until he either made a plea or died. On the first day, he would be given nothing to drink and just a small piece of barley bread. On the second day, he would be given a little water which lay nearest to the prison and meant it was probably stagnant. This continued with bread one day and water the next until the prisoner either relented and made a plea or died from starvation or disease. Some men lasted for weeks, and one lived on for as long as 40 days, so it was decided that weights should be laid on top of the prisoner, including stone slabs and iron bars, as much as he could bear and more. Early origins. The most primitive type of rack is thought to have originated in ancient Greece. The playwright Aristophanes wrote a comedy named The Frogs around the year 406 BCE. In it, Aristophanes mentions how Bacchus, disguised as a slave, is tortured in every way by tying him to a ladder, by suspending him, by scourging him with a whip, by cudgeling him, and by racking him. Later, Bacchus has vinegar poured into his nostrils and bricks heaped upon him just to make sure. So we know that racking was around in the 5th century BC. In the 4th century BC, the rack was used to force a confession from Herostratus. He was accused of burning down the Greek temple of Artemis in Ephesus, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Herostratus did confess under the torture, saying that he did it in an attempt to immortalize his name. If only he could see this YouTube video now. And according to the Greek historian Arion of Nicomedia, Alexander the Great had his pages tortured on the rack along with their mentor because they had conspired to assassinate him. The great Roman historian Tacitus wrote about the failed use of the rack in an attempt to obtain the names of those responsible for an assassination attempt on Emperor Nero in 65 AD. A leading member of the plot was a free woman named Epicharis. She was brought before Nero and ordered to be put on the rack. Despite the horrific torture that she suffered, Epicharis refused to name any of her co-conspirators or admit her guilt. She was carried back to the rack on the second day in a sedan chair because her arms and legs were so badly broken. On the way there, she was able to strangle herself using the girdle that fastened her to the chair. Tacitus praised her strength, concluding that many senators have betrayed their relatives without being tortured. The Russians named this form of punishment the shoe. It was recorded as a form of torture in 1229 in a contract made between the Russian city of Smolensk and the Baltic city of Riga, where the guilty were placed in the rack. the Duke's daughter. Most historians agree that it was John Holland, 2nd Duke of Exeter, who introduced the rack into England. Holland was the Constable of the Tower of London in 1447. This is why the rack became known as the Duke of Exeter's daughter. It was mostly used to extract confessions from those suspected of treason or heresy. A standard rack was an oblong frame of wood, slightly raised from the ground, having at one end a fixed bar to which the legs were fastened, and at the other end a movable bar to which the hands were tied. Using pulleys and levers, this latter could be rolled on its own axis, thus straining the ropes till the sufferer's joints were dislocated. As the medieval period went on, other embellishments and special improvements were added to the main mechanism, such as the one in Languedoc, France, which, in addition to the main rack which pulled the victim asunder by the feet and hands, had extra little racks devised to operate independently on each of his fingers and toes. The French also added other modifications like the spiked rollers that sliced open the skin and muscles of the back to intensify the pain. Some variations had a foot brace and a head frame to increase control, and a wheel to mechanize the stretching. As the rack evolved, we can see not only the advancement of technology during the Middle Ages, but also the growing brutality and inhumanity of the period. First, the horrified victim would be dragged to the rack, their arms and legs stretched out across a wooden frame, and their wrists and ankles bound down tightly with leather straps. With a roller at each end of the rack, the victim's arms and legs were attached by rope to each one. There would be a handle and ratchet mechanism fixed to the top roller, which the torturer's assistant would gradually turn to retract the rope. As the ropes began to tighten, the prisoner's body would begin to stretch, and a slight pressure would be felt in the shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows. At first, it wouldn't feel so bad, sort of like a morning stretch as you get out of bed. Then the aching and discomfort would begin, followed by the physical pain with every turn of the handle. But then the pain would suddenly stop, and the pressure would be released because this process was never meant to be quick. The torture was psychological as well as physical, and the prisoner had to be given the chance to confess, or at least divulge any important information. Sometimes a victim was strong and their spirit would not be broken, so the process began again. This time, with every creak of the tightening rope, the pain became more and more unbearable, even excruciating, as the spaces between the vertebrae began to expand and crack, and the joints dislocated as bones popped out of their sockets. Breathing became shallower as the victim's ribcage put pressure on his lungs, and a pitiful moaning noise escaped him as the muscles were torn and the man was crippled for the rest of his life. Still, the prisoner might not break, and the torturer can only wish that his rack had spiked rollers that would have sliced and torn the flesh from the criminal's back. Perhaps then he would have talked. Maybe the torturer would just keep going until the prisoner's limbs were torn from his body, and he could be left there to bleed out and die alone and in agony. A religious racking. The rack was used during many interrogations and torture sessions during the Middle Ages, including those of the Knights Templars and Sir William Wallace. It was also used in heresy cases such as that of Anne Askew. She was condemned as a Protestant heretic and is the only woman thought to have been both tortured at the Tower of London and then burned at the stake. In her own words, she described her torture, quote, "Then they did put me on the rack because I confessed no ladies or gentlewomen to be of my opinion, and there as they kept me a long time. And because I lay still and did not cry, my Lord Chancellor and Master Rich took pains to rack me with their hands till I was nigh dead. Then the lieutenant caused me to be loosed from the rack. Incontinually I swooned, and then they recovered me again." Anne was shown the rack in the White Tower and asked to name those who worshipped as she did. When she refused to name any others, she was told to remove her clothing and was placed on the rack in just her shift. As she was stretched, her body was twice raised about 5 inches above the rack. The lieutenant of the tower refused to continue the torture and went to seek out the king for a pardon. But her torturers, the Lord Chancellor and Sir Richard Rich, continued to turn the handles so hard that Anne's knees and elbows were dislocated, and her shoulders and her hips were torn from their sockets. Her screams were heard by the lieutenant's wife and daughter, who were in the garden next to the White Tower. Anne refused to name any who believed as she did or renounce her beliefs, and was convicted of heresy. Because of the torture she had endured, Anne, like Ephicaris before her, had to be carried on a chair to her execution as she could not walk. She was burned to death at Smithfield in London in 1546, aged just 25 years old. Across the course of history, the rack, along with other medieval torture devices, is a testament to the darker aspects of our past. In the Middle Ages, it was an accepted form of punishment and interrogation. The reputation of the rack filled people with so much terror that often just giving a suspected criminal a mere glimpse of the contraption was enough to elicit a confession. If the prisoner didn't confess or spill the required information immediately, then the Inquisition could go on for many agonizing hours, sometimes even for days. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Have a great week. Cheers.